"Well," said Trixie LaBouche, wiping the blue disinfectant from her face, "you've taken it a hell of a lot better than I expected. You're a groin-head rimmer." Lister set the toilet down on the floor and sighed. After a while he spoke again. "So how did you get the Juggernaut?" "I found it in the car park. It was the only one with the keys in it." Rimmer tilted Trixie LaBouche's head towards the floor. "Look, I'm sorry about the mess I caused, and—" His voice tailed off. Lister said nothing. "It was impossible to control the damn thing. Have you ever tried driving a 12-wheeled Juggernaut in 8-inch heeled stilettos?" "Why didn't you take them off?" "I couldn't reach the pedals. I'm only 5'2" now." "You're a groin-head rimmer, that's what you are. You're a total—" Lister shook his head. "Not content with destroying your own fantasy, you come here and destroy mine. What is wrong with your mind? It is totally diseased." I know, I can't help myself. My mind's got it in for me. We've got to get out of here." "You mean you've got to get out of here? I'm putting up your bail." Lister hammered on the cell door and called for Bert the cop. Bert the cop sat on the old wooden desk and finished counting out the $10 bills that represented Lister's life savings. "Sign here," he said curtly, and slid a release form across the desk. "Your life savings," he tutted. "I sure hope she's worth it." "Believe me, Bert," said Lister, "she isn't." Out on the main street, it was still mayhem. 2 fire engines were fighting a losing battle to save the orphanage. Dozens of people ran up and down, carrying water in anything they could find, and hurling it over the small fires that still pocked the main street. Families camped out under homemade tents made of blankets, while the injured were carefully stretchered into the back of farm vehicles and ferried to the county hospital more than 60 miles away. "Don't get too down," said Rimmer, patting Lister tenderly on the shoulder. "None of this really exists. You must have a hell of an appetite for destral fluid, Rimmer. Here." Lister waved his arm at the row of parked cars. "Pick one of these and drive it away. No one will mind. Just get the smeg out of here." "You don't understand. You've got to come with me. You've got to help me find Karen Crichton. We've all got to leave the game together." "I'm not leaving Bedford Falls." "But it's not real." "So, what have I got in reality? I'm the last human being alive, 3 million years out in deep space, without a prayer of ever getting back to Earth. Everything I want is here. Me—" He was going to say, "me wife," but he checked himself. "Me—" But the kids were gone too. His wife, his kids, his home, his little shop. Rimmer's single visit to Bedford Falls had laid waste the whole of his fantasy. "Don't you see? There's nothing to keep you here now. My mind destroyed it all. And if we don't get out of the game and back to reality, there's no telling what my psyche will do to us." "I'm going to stay. I can start again, get Chrissy back and the boys. It'll be all right." Rimmer shook his peroxide blonde head and pulled the trench coat he'd borrowed from Lister around his shivering form. "You don't understand, do you?" A huge triple tanker air-braked to a halt beside them. The driver leaned out of his window and spat a lump of chewing tobacco spittle onto the floor. "Hey, lady," he addressed Rimmer. "Can you tell me where the Bedford Falls Nuclear Waste Depot is?" Lister walked over to the cab. "Bedford Falls doesn't have a nuclear waste depot." "Sure it does," the driver nodded. "Opens tomorrow. It's supposed to be somewhere near the Newtown sewage plant on, let me see." He consulted a clipboard. "Sycamore Avenue." "Sorry," said Rimmer quietly. "There is no sewage plant on Sycamore Avenue," Lister insisted. "Sure there is." The driver pointed into the murky, smoke-laden sky. "You can see the stacks." Lister looked. All around Bedford Falls were huge, obscene configurations of industrial chimneys, belching thick black clouds into the night air. "Look!" The driver spat another brown plume onto the street.
"If you can just direct me as far as the prison, I'll find my way from there."
"What prison? You mean the jailhouse?"
"No, the new prison. The new open prison. The one they've just opened for the rehabilitation of psychopathic serial killers."
Lister looked at Rimmer, who just shrugged hopelessly. They walked across the street and headed for the line of parked cars. As they passed the rubble that had been his home, Lister spotted something. He stooped, tossed aside a couple of bricks, and picked up a blue sailing yacht which still bore the price tag, $2.25. He smoothed down the sails and clutched it to his chest. "Come on," he said finally. "Let's get out of here." They climbed into one of the cars, an Oldsmobile. Rimmer in the driving seat, Lister beside him. Rimmer started up the engine. "Hang on," said Lister. "Might be an idea if I drive." They swapped places. As Rimmer slid into the passenger seat, there was a crunch of broken wood. He arched his back and fished out a squashed yacht. "What the hell's this?" he said, and tossed it out of the window. Lister wiggled the gear lever into first, and the Oldsmobile bumbled down the devastated Main Street and up the hill, out of Bedford Falls. As they reached the hill's crest, Lister stopped the car and craned round. He'd been in BTL now for nearly 2 years, and he had never thought he'd leave. Bedford Falls was his own personal nirvana. His psyche had created a town and a community based on his all-time favorite movie, Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life, and this was where he'd wanted to spend the rest of his days. He'd been aware, though he had never thought about it too much, that BTL would eventually kill him. His body, out there in reality, would gradually waste away and die. But it was a deal he'd been prepared to accept. Here, in the game, he'd had everything he had desired, a community full of good people, his kids, his little shop, and best of all, he was married to Christine Kochanski. Out there in reality, he had none of this, nor any chance of ever getting it. And worse still, in reality, Christine Kochanski was dead. Christine Kochanski had been the one and only good thing that had happened to Lister since he'd signed up with Red Dwarf. In fact, she'd been the only good thing to happen to him since that drunken night of his 24th birthday celebration, which ended with him coming to in a burger bar on Mimas, wearing only a pair of yellow fishing waders and a lady's pink crimpline hat. Ever since that night, his life had been a constant struggle to get back home to Earth. Frankly, he hadn't had much success. He'd gone from Earth to Mimas, and from there to some unknown location in the middle of deep space, and now here he was, in the wrong plane of the wrong dimension of reality. Well, he'd had enough. He'd quit. BTL was where he was staying. This was where he wanted to be, because it was the only place he could be with Christine Kochanski. Now it was over, he had to go. He stared down at the ruined town, then turned back and started to release the handbrake as 5 jet fighters from the new Bedford Falls Air Force Base screamed in formation above him. "Thanks a lot, pal," he said to Rimmer. "Thanks a lot." The cat curled up happily on his dogskin chaise longue, flicking idly through the TV channels with his remote control. Because of his notoriously short boredom threshold, most cat programs lasted less than 2 minutes, and the advert breaks in between were a short sequence of flash-frame blips. He flicked on Channel 2. It was a TV phone-in, where cats with sexual problems called in and a panel of experts laughed at them.
"Line 7 now. What's the problem, buddy?" "I met this female, and, for some reason, I still don't understand why, but for some reason, I felt like hanging around after we had sex." "You felt like what?"
The panel screamed and slapped their hands on the desk. The cat snorted,
"The guy is sick!"
and flicked channels. He joined the middle of a cookery show which was demonstrating 101 different ways of preparing hairballs. He flicked again, and found a fashion show which had been recorded the night before and was consequently massively outmoded, this being the middle of the following afternoon. Next was some stupid love story, with the same plot as all cat love stories. Boy meets girl, boy leaves girl, boy gets another girl. The cat shook his head. Romantic slush. Flick. Mouse tennis. Flick. At last something interesting. MTV, the 24-hour mirror channel. The cat gazed lovingly at his reflected image, while smoochy music piped softly through the speakers. The program was totally ruined less than 3 hours later when a 30-millisecond advert break spoilt his concentration, and he flicked the set off in disgust. He slipped the gold fob watch out of his waistcoat, flicked open the cover, and stared at the dial. The cat had replaced the conventional numbers with a series of symbols which stood for food, sex, snooze, light snooze, heavy snooze, major sleep, self-adoration hour, preening, and bath time. Right now, it was 20 past sex. Or to put it another way, quarter to food. He snapped the watch closed and tugged the bell pull by his side. Then, instead of 10 half-naked oiled Valkyries charging through with silver platters piled high with every kind of fish imaginable ready to tend his smallest whim, absolutely nothing happened. He jerked the bell pull once more, and again absolutely nothing happened. Slightly panicked, the cat consulted his watch again. This was serious. His whole schedule was getting messed up. He was less than 20 minutes away from his 7th major snooze of the day, and he still had to cram in sex and lunch. Where were the Valkyries? He went over to the wall, opened the dumbwaiter hatch, climbed in, and shimmied down the rope to the kitchens. Crichton, as usual, was in the kitchens, mopping the cat's huge black-and-white checked stone floor.
"I've nearly finished,"
said Crichton to the cat as he climbed out of the hatch.
"Just a few more minutes, and then we really must get back to reality. Oh, look at this!"
he orgasmed.
"A custard stain, and it goes right across the length of the floor."
Where are the Valkyries?
They formed the Valkyrie Sex Slave Liberation Movement and left for the mainland. You just missed them.
They what?
Yes, they were sick and tired of bowing to your every whim and desire.
The cat slumped into a carved oak chair.
Why?
He said, genuinely mystified.
Well, if you'll pardon my directness, it's fairly obvious, isn't it?
It is?
Of course it is.
The cat wrinkled his nose.
What's that smell?
He stood up and sniffed around.
It's like bad cheese. What is it?
He flung open a leaded window and looked down.
The moat's curdled. It's never done that before.
Don't worry, said Crichton. I'll clean it all out and put in some fresh milk, just as soon as I've finished.
He stared down at the broken mop handle in his hand.
Well, that's curious.
The cat leaned back in from the window.
What's that out there?
Crichton waddled over with his broken mop head and his suddenly leaking bucket and joined him.
That's a volcano,
said Crichton.
Never noticed that before, said the cat. And what's that funny red smoky bubbly stuff coming out of the top?
Magma,
said Crichton chirpily, pleased he knew the answer to the question.
Also known as molten lava.
Is it dangerous?
Only if it's heading this way.
It is heading this way,
said Crichton, his circuits locked in panic mode.
I don't get it.
The cat scuffed his spatted boot against the wrought iron stove.
What's going on here?
Perhaps she can explain that, said Lister. The cat and Crichton turned to see Lister standing under the expansive arch of the kitchen's door, with a peroxide blonde in fishnet stockings, 8-inch stilettos, and a huge army trench coat. "He's right," she said. "It's my fault, all of it." The castle rocked as the volcano's plug was blasted into the stratosphere, blackening the sky and showering the cat's estate with volcanic ash and flaming boulders. The cat was the only one who kept his footing.
What are we gonna do?
We're going to do what we should have done a long time ago, said Lister, climbing to his feet. We're getting out of here. We're going back to reality. The LCD display melted from 0659 to 0700, and a millisecond before the alarm was set to bray into life, Lister's arm stretched out from under the regulation-issue duvet and clicked it off with a satisfying plip. His body was spiced inside with that red-letter-day feeling, like something wonderful had happened, but his half-awake mind hadn't quite remembered it. He right-angled his body, swiveled round, slid his feet into the soft warmth of the slippers, and shuffled over to the viewport window. He gazed out into the black felt of space. Diamonds of light glimmered and gleamed a welcome home. I'm back, he thought. Back on Red Dwarf. Back in reality. A contented smile spread itself into a yawn on his face. He turned and opened the sleeping quarters fridge. He pulled out a jug of freshly squeezed orange juice and a saran-wrapped half-grapefruit. He flicked the percolator to espresso and went through to the shower cubicle as the coffee machine gurgled its good morning. We've done it. We've beaten it. We're out. He spun the taps, and water Niagara'd onto the pine-scented rubber shower mat. He pushed his hand into the curtain of water, warm and perfect, not hot, not cold, just perfect. It was good to be alive. He scrubbed himself first date clean, grabbed a thick white towel, and dabbed himself dry. He padded back to the coffee machine and sluiced down a quite superb cup of espresso. He poured himself another. The second cup tasted even better than the first. And that was when Lister started to think. The second cup tasted better than the first? The second cup never tasted better than the first. He clicked open the fridge door. It looked like an advert for refrigerators. It was packed with fresh vegetables and crisp salads. There were 8 kinds of cheese, various slices of lean cooked meat, a whole salmon, a rack of lamb tipped with little paper chef's hats, and a bottle of champagne on chill. Was this really his fridge? Where was the curdling milk struggling out of the top of its carton? Where was the strange smell that sent his stomach into a loop-de-loop and was impossible to track down? Where was his spare pair of trainers? He usually kept them in the ice compartment to cool down. There was nothing in the ice compartment, except a varied selection of delicious-sounding ice creams and, for the first time in history, some ice. Ice? What was ice doing in the ice-making compartment of Lister's fridge? And where was that indefinable green mush in the salad tray, the one that resulted from decaying vegetables blending together so it was impossible to tell where the lettuces ended and the cabbages began? No, this was a fridge that belonged in a mail-order catalogue. This was the fridge that the Great Gatsby flung open when Daisy came calling. There was something wrong. And what was wrong was there was nothing wrong. He looked down at his ship regulation issue bath towel. Space Corps towels were famous for 2 features. Firstly, they were as thin as damp poppadoms and about half as absorbent. And secondly, they were too short to wrap around the waist. They always left a Balinese dancing girl gap down the side of one leg. Not this one. This was thick as a rug and lapped his waist twice. Maybe he'd got thinner. Maybe. Lister caromed over to the bread bin and flipped the lid. He groaned. There was bread in it, freshly baked, white, brown, wholemeal, multigrain, baps, rolls. He hauled out a farmhouse loaf, carved a slice, and slammed it under the grill. He paced up and down impatiently, waiting for the bread to toast. His mind rewound to the night before. The 4 of them, passing through the exit gate and emerging in the cargo hold. Rimmer changing en route from Trixie LaBouche's body back to his own hologrammatic form. Their conversation with Holly. The pauseless journey back up to the sleeping quarters, the shuttle bus, the ship metro, the express lift up 2,050 floors, They hadn't had to wait for any of them. He looked under the grill. The bread was ready. Feverishly he buttered it, and then spread a thick layer of chunky lime marmalade over its evenly brown surface. He held the toast in his hand, parallel with his chin, 5 feet from the floor, and dropped it. It spun end over end and landed. He looked down. It was marmalade up. He tried it again. Marmalade up. And again, and again. 20 times it landed marmalade up. Lister rifled through the sleeping quarters. Nothing was right. The half-full sauce bottle had no congealed brown rivulets running from neck to label. The remote control for the vid screen wasn't missing, and even more damningly, the batteries hadn't been taken out and used for something else. Another test. He microwaved a roast beef and Yorkshire pudding frozen dinner. It tasted like roast beef and Yorkshire pudding. That just wasn't possible. A microwave dinner that tasted better than its cardboard container? He opened his locker and glanced at his collection of videos. They were standing in neat ranks side by side, all boxed and labelled in his own hand. And worse, he found at least 30 he'd recorded and actually wanted to watch. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. He was frying his 23rd egg without breaking a single yolk when Crichton bustled in.
"It's incredible. The most marvelous thing has happened. I was mopping the floor, that really dirty one on the stasis corridor, the one with the really wonderful stains, when guess what? I looked in the suspended animation booths, and not all the crew got wiped out in the accident. 3 survived."
"Let me guess," said Lister. "Rimmer, Peterson, and Christine Kachansky."
"Yes!" Crichton clapped his hands in delight. "How did you know?"
"We're still in the game, Crichton. This isn't reality." Rimmer skidded in through the sleeping quarters hatchway.
Guess what?
He beamed.
"Something incredible's just happened."
"This isn't reality," said Lister. The cat's smile entered the room, followed by the cat himself.
Hey! You're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you."
"We're still in better than life," said a crestfallen Rimmer. The cat's eyebrows met in a head-on collision over the bridge of his nose.
"Huh?"
"Well done," said a voice. They all turned to see a small figure materialize in the corner of the quarters. It was a boy, 14 years old, with spiked greasy hair, wearing over-large glasses, a purple anorak, and a wispy pubescent moustache.
"My name is Dennis McBean,"
the 3D recording continued.
"I am the game's designer. You've negotiated the final obstacle in the most addictive computer game ever devised. You've earned a replay." "No thanks, Acne Face,"
said the cat. The figure blipped off, and the sleeping quarters slowly began to fade away. Suddenly, they were standing on a green grid matrix, which tapered off into an infinite blackness. A light appeared, and they walked towards it. As they approached the opening, huge letters whooshed under their feet, a gigantic R, then an E, then a V followed by an O. Then above their heads flew another set of letters, an E, an M, an A, and finally, a G. Finally, they'd made it. They staggered into the light and back out into reality. Slowly, very slowly, Lister's eyes adjusted to the gloom. It was dark. A small, dim emergency bulb was the room's only light source. Gradually, he made out the silhouettes of the others, half sitting, half crumpled in an irregular semicircle. He reached up and felt the headband through the matted mess of his hair, then gingerly eased the slurping electrodes out of his skull. Shivering, he watched as the others also wrenched themselves free and hurled their headbands into the middle of the semicircle. There was no conversation, no eye contact. Someone started coughing. Lister knew it was the cat without looking. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't help himself. His eyes darted to the right. He looked away again quickly. The cat was barely recognizable. His eyes seemed far too big for his face, as if his skull had shrunk. Flesh hung loosely from his gaunt, jutting bones. Lister studied his own trembling arms, thin. His skin was like paper. He tried to get up. He wanted to stamp on the headsets, to crush them, but he collapsed pathetically back on the floor. Then he rolled on his back and couldn't get up. He was as weak as a day-old giraffe. Crichton and Rimmer were fine, at least physically. Mechanoids and holograms don't suffer from muscle wastage. They got to their feet. Crichton spoke.
"I'll get a couple of—"
He didn't finish. He didn't want to say stretchers. He didn't want to say,
"We'd better get them to the medical unit as quickly as possible, because they look like hell."
Rimmer understood and nodded. Crichton ducked through the hatchway and into the corridor outside. The ship appeared to be on emergency power, which made no sense to Crichton. It made even less sense that everything was in such disarray. Congealed food which had spouted out of a faulty dispensing machine lay rotting on the floor. Water dripped in rusty pools through the metal-slatted ceiling from the corridor above. Thousands of wall circuits were burnt out, black and dead. All the screens which usually carried Holly's image were blank and lifeless. It was like a Sunday afternoon on the Marie Celeste. Crichton spent a good 20 minutes looking for some scutters. He finally tracked down a small group of them in the maintenance depot playing cards.
"What on earth do you think you're doing?"
Crichton clucked.
"Everything's absolutely filthy. Nothing's working."
He clapped his hands.
"Come along."
The 4 scutters pivoted their claw heads round to see who it was, and went back to playing 5-card stud for nuts and bolts.
"Excuse me,"
Crichton waddled up to the table.
"If you want to get into Silicon Heaven, then I suggest you start obeying orders fairly smartly."
The scutters' motors revved up and down in electronic sniggers. They didn't believe in Silicon Heaven. They were such basic work droids, the manufacturers hadn't considered it cost-effective to fit them with belief chips. As far as they were concerned, only loony droids believed in Silicon Heaven, whacked-out crazies like Crichton. Their own point of view was that the universe was totally meaningless, unjust and pointless, and the only single thing of any substance or beauty in the whole of creation was the double-threaded wingnut, which was easy to screw on or off even in the most inaccessible of places. They were basically existentialists with a penchant for a certain metal bonding device.
"Now,"
said Crichton, flapping his palms against his thighs,
"get 2 stretchers and follow me."
Reluctantly the scutters threw in their cards and grumbled after Crichton on their motorized bases. When Crichton returned with 4 scutters pushing 2 stretchers, Rimmer was standing in the corridor. "Listen," he said. "Hear anything?" Crichton tilted his head and set his ear microphones to maximum. "Hear it?" said Rimmer. Crichton couldn't hear anything, apart from an overweight asthmatic beetle 3 floors below who was trying to climb up a wall. For simplicity's sake, he said,
"I can't hear anything."
Rimmer's head jabbed forward. "Neither can I," he said, and smiled enigmatically. It was a tricky moment for Crichton. He had 2 sick humanoids to look after, 4 rebellious scutters, and now it appeared he had to contend with an insane hologram.
"No, don't you get it?"
said Rimmer.
Get what?
Said Crichton uncertainly.
"We can't hear anything.
Yes?
The engines are dead. The ship is not moving."
Crichton wheeled Lister and the cat into the medical unit's recovery bay. He removed their ragged, stinking clothes, bathed them carefully, and gave them vitamin boosts. Then he connected his 2 patients up to the biofeedback computer and gently slipped them into the medisuits. Once the medisuits were fully inflated, Crichton hung them on their 4 support poles so Lister and the cat hung face up, immobile, and engaged the suit's power units. All the while he chattered lightly about nothing in particular, carefully avoiding any mention of the dead engines. When they were sleeping peacefully, he left to join Rimmer in the drive room. "I've been all over the drive deck, everywhere. All Holly's screens are out. He won't respond." Crichton shuffled over to the bank of monitors and punched the keys for a status report. Grudgingly, the machine on emergency power finally chundered a printout.
He's switched himself off,
said Crichton.
Look.
Rimmer glanced at the incomprehensible gobbledygook of the symbols.
Ah!
He said as if he understood them. He's switched himself off.
And here,
Crichton flicked the report with his finger.
For some reason, there was a massive power surge just 7 minutes before he went offline.
Rimmer peered over Crichton's shoulder and hoped he was looking at the right section of gibberish which revealed this particular piece of information.
That's what it says, he confirmed. There's no denying it.
Crichton was impressed. Very few non-mechanicals could read machine right, especially upside down.
This is insane!
Rimmer walked through the huge corridor of stacked disk drives.
The ship's totally helpless.
Crichton followed him.
Why should he want to turn himself off?
There's only one way to find out.
Rimmer stopped in front of Holly's enormous main screen.
Let's turn him back on and ask him.
Crichton typed in the reboot commands, and Holly flashed up on the screen. Rimmer looked up.
Holly? What's happened?
At first, Holly looked like he didn't know where he was, as if he'd just woken up, and was getting his bearings. Then, suddenly, his eyes widened and he flicked off. The buzzing computer banks ran back down into silence. Rimmer looked at Crichton.
Try it again.
Crichton recalled the reboot command. Holly appeared on the screen.
"Go away,"
he said quickly, and turned himself off again. Rimmer shook his head.
What's wrong with him? Give me voice control on the reboot command.
Crichton obliged.
On,
said Rimmer. Holly appeared again.
"Off,"
he said, and flicked off.
On,
Rimmer persisted.
"Off,"
Holly countered.
Is there any way we can override his shutdown disk?
Crichton nodded and tapped at the keyboard.
Try it now,
he said.
On!
Holly rippled onto the screen.
"Off,"
he said, but stayed there.
"Off,"
he repeated more firmly, but nothing happened. Pixelized veins stood out on his head.
"Off,"
he screamed.
"Off, off, off!"
Now then,
said Rimmer calmly.
Perhaps we can have a proper conversation conducted in a civilized and dignified manner.
"What have you done? Take out the inhibitor. Switch me back off."
Rimmer held up his hand to silence the ranting computer.
"Off!"
yelled Holly.
"No time to explain. Intelligence compressed. Reduced lifespan. Toaster's fault. 2.35 remaining."
Come again?
said Rimmer.
IQ 12,000. 2 minutes left.
Holly, I have not the slightest clue what you're gibbering about. IQ 12,000, 2 minutes left, toaster's fault. What does all that mean?
Holly closed his eyes and sighed.
"You're a total smeghead, aren't you, Rimmer? What's the problem? Where's the difficulty? Why are you still unable to grasp this extraordinarily simple premise?"
What premise?
The premise that I have increased my intelligence quotient to 12,000. Well, to be more precise, 12,368, and as a consequence my run time has been reduced to 2.5 minutes. Thanks to the toaster, I have 2.5 minutes left to live. Well, actually, because of this inanely unnecessary conversational interchange, I now have 1 minute and 10 seconds left to live. Understand? Savvy, bimbo brain? Any further questions you require answering? Take your time, 55 seconds and counting, no rush.
My God, said Rimmer. That's terrible. Hadn't we better turn you off?
Let me think,
said Holly, and after a tiny pause, added in a voice that shook the drive room, Yes! Crichton! Rimmer yelled. Remove the inhibitor! Crichton was staring into one of the scanner scopes. He looked up and blinked.
What? Right, yes, sorry.
45 seconds,
Holly moaned, as Crichton removed the inhibitor command and the chagrin computer face vanished from the screen.
Poor Holly,
Crichton muttered and went back to the scanner scope. What are you looking at? Asked Rimmer.
Well, it's not really my place to say,
said Crichton.
I'm a sanitation mechanoid. I should be cleaning.
Rimmer looked down at the scanner scope. That's very pretty. What's that rather striking bluey white thing streaking across the screen towards the red thing?
The red thing is Red Dwarf,
said Crichton. And the bluey white thing? Rimmer squinted at the tiny flashing dot on the scanner. Looks like it's heading towards us at a fair old lick. What is it? A rock? A little comet? An extremely small ice asteroid?
No, it's a
Crichton's head jerked repetitively through the same series of motions, a kind of body stammer that always afflicted the 4000 series whenever they were faced with certain death.
A
Rimmer smiled indulgently. What's that? Crichton smashed his head into the scanner scope and cleared the seizure loop in his voice unit.
It's a planet.
Rimmer didn't say anything for a rather long time, and when he did say something, it wasn't anything particularly scintillating or original. A planet, he said. Are you saying that's a planet? Crichton looked down at the 1000-fold 3D magnification of the projectile on the scanner scope.
Something must have ripped it out of its orbit.
A planet, Rimmer repeated completely unnecessarily. A planet's going to hit us. Crichton nodded. Well, hadn't we better get out of the way, then?
We can't move. The engines are dead.
How long will it take to get the engines up and running? Crichton typed a series of equations into the numeric keypad and waited for the data to be processed.
About 3 weeks.
Rimmer rubbed his temples and asked a question he didn't want to know the answer to. And how long before this planet hits the ship? Crichton frowned, and his fingers trilled across the keypad. Finally, the readout blipped up onto the screen in green. Well? Said Rimmer. Crichton looked up.
About 3 weeks.
There seemed little point in telling Lister and the cat about the rogue planet screaming through space towards them. Physically, they were in no shape to help. True, they were recovering well, suspended hammock-like in the medisuits, the suit's internal hydrotherapy units massaging their wasted muscle fibre back to health, but they were still hopelessly weak, and the anxiety would only slow down the recuperation process. Crichton, forever cautious, estimated they'd need at least a month in the suits, followed by another 2 weeks of complete rest before they could be discharged from the MU. Rimmer hated keeping the news to himself. In his opinion, the best part of having bad news was being able to tell as many people as possible. He loved it when people's faces collapsed in that funny way, as if someone had sliced a string that held up all their muscles. But this was the least enjoyable bad news he'd ever had. He squirmed through his nightly visits to the medical unit and took advantage of the least excuse to curtail them. The strain of sitting there pretending everything was hunky-dory and la-di-da while this planet was yowling towards them was intolerable. He wanted to break down and confess. He wanted to beat the floor and wail like a professional mourner. He wanted to whip everyone up into a frenzy of self-pity and panic. Instead, he had to sit there and be selfless and brave. What was the point of being selfless and brave if no one knew about it? So he kept the visits down to a minimum and spent most of his free time overseeing the priming of the engines. Red Dwarf's engines occupied most of the rear third of the ship. 8 cubic miles of steel and grease that ran across 1,000 corridors. To start the ship, 4,680 spark chambers had to be primed and fired at precisely timed intervals. Millions of gallons of hydrogen-based fuel, recycled from the currents of space through the ram scoop at the front of the ship, had to be pumped through a network of interconnecting pipelines to coincide exactly with the firing of the spark chambers. It was a filthy, laborious task, even with a full crew. For a mechanoid, a hologram, and 47 scutters, it was backbreaking. Rimmer moaned constantly. He couldn't understand how the Space Corps could spend zillions upon zillions of dollar pounds designing a ship the size of Red Dwarf and not put a couple of buckquid to one side for the fitting of a start button. Just one little red button marked Blast Off. How much would that have set them back? Crichton pointed out repeatedly that Red Dwarf wasn't designed to stop. The nearest the ship ever came to rest was when it went into orbit around a planet. The idea that it might one day come to a grinding halt had never occurred to anyone. The explanations seemed to matter little to Rimmer, who kept on obsessively calculating the prices of small plastic buttons. Even the most expensive button, Rimmer surmised, even one that came in a futuristic-y kind of shape, carved from rhinoceros tusk, with blast-off, hand-painted by Leonardo da Vinci in radioactive gold dust, couldn't have cost all that much. Crichton patiently explained that it probably wasn't so much the design of the button that had proved too expensive, but more the vast network of computer relays and the thousands of miles of cables the button would have to be connected to that made it prohibitive. But Rimmer wasn't interested. Moaning helped him get through the mind-numbing task of supervising the scutters as they primed the spark chambers. He whiled away many an hour mentally embellishing the fabulous blast-off button, studding it with diamonds and rubies and trimming it in platinum, yet still keeping the cost below that of a single sleeping quarters compartment. Even so, the work was going well. In fact, they were slightly ahead of schedule, and well within the safety margins they had built into the timetable, when Rimmer made his mistake. It happened in one of the piston towers, a half-mile-high steel cylinder which housed the massive piston heads. In all, there were 1,200 of them. Rimmer's section took 600. Crichton's section dealt with the rest. Naturally, Rimmer wanted to complete his half of the task before Crichton, so he had the scutters switch themselves up to maximum so they could triple their speed. Their little engines whined and screamed as they raced in and out of the towers, checking the spark chamber relays were open. After each tower had been primed, its 8,000-ton piston head had to be tested. Rimmer thought the 20 scutters that made up his A section were in piston tower 137 when he cleared piston tower 136 for testing. He listened as the piston head thundered down, then nodded to his secretary scutter to tick the check sheet, and moved on to piston tower 138. For some reason, A section was missing. Of course, it must already be on to the next tower. He ordered 137 to be tested, and moved hurriedly along. He waited. He couldn't believe it. Now B section was missing too. He searched all the towers from 150 back down and still couldn't find a single scutter. It didn't make sense. Where could they be? Finally, he walked into Tower 137 and spotted a wafer-thin layer of sheet metal covering the piston tower's floor. He'd never noticed it before, but there was another one in 136. It was a very familiar feeling for Rimmer. The horrible slow dawning, the internal denials, the frantic mental search for someone else to blame, the gradual acceptance that once again He'd done something so unspeakably asinine it would live with him for the rest of his days, lurking in the horror pit of his mind, along with 9 or 10 other monstrous ineptitudes that screamed and railed there, never allowing him to forget them. This one he reckoned ranked number 4. The squashing to death of 40 scutters now eased into Rimmer's horror charts, just above accidentally shooting his father through the shoulder with his own service revolver, and just below the time he inadvertently reversed over his Aunt Belinda's show poodle. With half the scutters destroyed, it was now impossible to start up the engines in time. There was only one option left: abandon ship. Lister and the cat, suspended in neighbouring medisuits, stared up at the video monitor on the ceiling. Bored wasn't the word for it. They'd been cooped up in the MU for the best part of 3 weeks, and Crichton still insisted they stay put. They were sick of being sick, and the more they recovered, the worse the feeling got. Part of the problem was that they'd spent almost 2 years in better than life, and they were both used to getting anything they wanted the instant they wanted it. They'd forgotten the countless delays, compromises, and general inconveniences of reality. For Lister, the BTL cold turkey was compounded by the fact that he was now 27. 27! He was a codger. 27 and heading into beer gut country. Soon he'd be one of those sad old farts who have to play squash to keep fit, and drink mineral water, and know about calories. 27. A has-been. In 3 years, he'd be practically senile. He'd be 30. It was too depressing for words. So he lay grumpily in his medisuit alongside the cat, with nothing to do except read old comics and watch videos. The only video they both agreed was an indisputable classic was The Flintstones, which they watched for 15 or 16 hours every day. After perhaps 90 hours of watching The Flintstones, something strange seemed to happen to Lister. "Cat?" he grunted, without removing his eyes from the screen. "Hmm?" the cat grunted back. "Is it me, or is Wilma Flintstone incredibly sexy?" The cat swiveled and looked at him, then turned his head back to the screen.
"Wilma Flintstone," he said with quiet authority, "is, without question, the most desirable woman who ever lived."
Lister looked at him to see if he was serious. He was. "That's good," he said. "I thought I was going a bit wacko. What do you think of Betty?"
"Betty Rubble?"
The cat mulled it over.
"Well, I would go with Betty,"
he said, then added wistfully,
"but I'd be thinking of Wilma."
They both lapsed into silent reverie. "What are we doing?" Lister said finally. "I think we've been in the medical unit for too long. Why are we talking about making love to Wilma Flintstone?"
"You're right,"
the cat agreed.
"We're nuts. This is an insane conversation."
Lister shook his head sadly. "She'd never leave Fred, and we know it." Crichton's face, when it appeared through the recovery bay's hatchway, was simultaneously wearing 2 expressions. The bottom half was calm, benign, and kindly. The top half, his eyes and forehead, was shot through with panic.
"And how are you two feeling?"
he said soothingly, his voice obviously siding with all the features south of his nose. Lister and the cat grunted non-committally.
"Now, there's absolutely no reason for concern, but we're going to have to move you,"
he said, and began loosening the medisuit support straps. "Why?"
"No reason. Just keep resting and getting better. That's all you have to worry about."
"I don't want to be moved," the cat protested. "I want to watch the Flintstones. This is the one where Fred and Barney go away, and Wilma and Betty are left alone."
Crichton pushed the hover stretcher parallel with his bed.
"Just lie back and relax. We're going to go on a little walk."
"Where to?"
"Nowhere in particular. I just thought it would be nice."
"Crichton, what's going on?"
"The Medicomp said no stress. Now just try and get some sleep."
Crichton, I'm not getting on that stretcher until you tell me what's going on. Crichton smiled.
If you absolutely must know, there's a tiny little planet that might be possibly heading on a collision course with us, but there's absolutely nothing to worry about, he said soothingly.
A planet?
It's only a small planet.
Why doesn't the ship just get out of the way?
The engines are sort of deadish. But that's not a matter that should concern you. Now please, get on the stretcher.
Lister tried to wrestle himself upright in his medisuit. Why don't we make the engines sort of undeadish?
We can't.
Crichton smiled benignly. What does Holly say?
Well, Holly is sort of deadish, too. Now please, get on the stretcher and try and relax.
Lister and the cat sat bolt upright, rigid with panic. What are we going to do, then?
We're going to go on a nice little walk down to the cargo bay, and then depending on how we're all feeling, who knows, we might even do a spot of abandoning shipping.
Crichton patted the stretcher and watched helplessly as Lister and the cat unvelcroed their medisuits, ripped off the biofeedback sensors, and belted out of the room and down the corridor. It fell to Rimmer to give Holly the news that they couldn't take him with them. His hardware was far too vast to be evacuated onto the small transporter, and so Rimmer felt it was only decent to switch him on and let him enjoy the 55 seconds of runtime that remained to him before the planet oblivionized Red Dwarf and everything on it. He sat at his sloping architect's desk in the sleeping quarters, bathed in the emergency lighting, and reread the speech he'd written. It didn't seem nearly as succinct as he remembered when he dictated it to his secretary Scudder. In all, it covered 9 pages of A4, and when he timed it, he discovered it lasted over 16 minutes. He had to make some cuts and get it down to 5 seconds at the most. But it all seemed essential. His 2-page tirade against the Space Corps and their loathing for blast-off buttons. It seemed a pity to lose that. His 3-page report on the squashed Scudder incident, which laid the blame firmly in the lap of person or persons unknown. How could that go? But in the end he managed to get it down to 12 words. Planet collision course, engines dead, impact 12 hours, abandoning ship, sorry, bye. With practice, Rimmer found he could say the whole message in just under 2 seconds. This still left Holly a full 53 seconds of runtime to enjoy in whatever way he chose. Rimmer voice-activated the reboot disc, and Holly's pixelized image assembled itself on the sleeping quarters vidscreen. Rimmer went into his speech. Planet collision course, engines dead, impact 12 hours, abandoning ship, sorry, bye. Holly blinked. You what? Rimmer took a deep breath and ripped into his speech a second time. Planet collision course, engines dead, impact 12 hours, abandoning ship, sorry, bye. Eh? Planet collision course, engines dead, impact 12 hours, abandoning ship, sorry, bye. That's what you said the last time. What does it mean? Rimmer was halfway through it for a 4th time. Planet collision course, engines dead, impact... Before Holly stopped him. I can't understand a word. Say it slower. Planet? Said Rimmer. Yes, said Holly. Collision course? Said Rimmer. Yes, said Holly. Engines dead? Right. Impact 12 hours? With you. Abandoning ship? Oh. Sorry? Yes. Bye. Within 2 seconds, Holly absorbed the data from the scannerscope, mulled the problem over, and said 2 words. The 2 words were, drive room. Then he switched himself off with less than 25 seconds of runtime remaining. Rimmer met Lister, the cat, and Crichton dashing down the corridor towards the cargo bay. Drive room! Rimmer shouted. Drive room? Lister shouted back. Why? I think Holly's come up with something. They heard the babble and chatter of operational machinery long before they passed under the colossal archway that led into the drive room itself. Traction-fed computer printout chundered onto the floor from every one of the 2,600 printers. The whole chamber was knee-deep in writhing reams of paper. What the smeg is going on? Lister screamed above the machine noise, the remnants of his biofeedback tubes clattering behind him. Crichton stooped and picked up a section of printout.
It's machine speak. Calculations.
What kind of calculations? Yelled Rimmer. Suddenly the machine stopped chattering. Above them, the immense screen which covered the entire ceiling, normally host to Holly's image, rippled into life. Solution, it read, and then underneath was a list of coordinates. Below that was a 3D graphics display of Holly's plan. It was quite the most audacious piece of astronavigation ever attempted in the entire history of the universe. On the screen was a simulation of the binary star system in which they were now marooned, motionless. At the bottom of the screen was a vector graphic of Red Dwarf. At the top of the screen was the blue ice planet, hurtling towards them on its collision course. To the left was a small sun, and to the right was its larger twin. Both were orbited by single planets. Starbug, Red Dwarf's beetle-shaped transport craft, then flashed on the screen. The craft blipped a course towards the right-hand sun and fired something into its core. The sun flared, its planet was torn from its orbit and hurled towards the center of the screen. Lister watched, bewildered and bemused, as the display dissolved into a dazzling array of plotted lines and arrows. When the screen finally cleared, all 3 planets now orbited the sun on the left, and Red Dwarf remained intact.
"Let me get this straight," said Lister. "Is he doing what I think he's doing?"
"Think he's doing?"
asked the cat.
"I think he's playing pool with planets."
Crichton stared pointlessly at the blank screen.
Is that possible?
"Well," said Rimmer, "it's certainly possible to fire a thermonuclear device into a sun and create enough of a solar flare to throw a planet out of orbit. The rest of it is somewhat in the realms of hypothesis." Lister creaked into one of the console seats and shook his head grimly.
"It's not going to work. I promise you. It's not going to work. No way, Jose, not in a month of Uranian Sundays. If Holly thinks he can use the red planet to pot the blue planet into the left-hand sun's orbit, then he's out to breakfast, lunch and tea."
You don't think so?
said Crichton.
"No chance. There's not enough side."
Side?
"Side spin. His cueing angle's all wrong."
"Lister, what are you drivelling about?" Rimmer snorted in contempt. "We're talking about a computer with an IQ of 12,368.
"That doesn't mean he can play pool."
Lister placed his palm on his chest.
"I can. Trust me. I know whereof I speak. Egbert arms on a Friday night couldn't get me off that table. This pool arm,"
he flexed his right arm,
"is sound as a pound. And I promise you, that shot's not going to come off. He's topped it, that's what he's done. It's a felt ripper. That planet's off the table and into somebody's glass of beer."
Rimmer brayed incredulously.
"We're talking about the trigonomics of 4-dimensional space, you simple-minded gimboid. We're not talking about some seedy game of pool in a backstreet scouse drinking pit."
"Same principle."
"Of course it isn't."
Lister nodded at the giant screen.
"I'm telling you, it's a complete miscue, and I say we chuck Holly's coordinates in the bin and let me take the shot."
"Well," Rimmer stood apart from the rest of the group, "I say we put it to the vote. On the one hand, we have a computer with an IQ in 5 figures, who has a complete and total grasp of astrophysics, and on the other hand, we have Lister, who, and let's be fair to him, is a complete gimp. To whose hands do we entrust our lives, the safety of this vessel, and the future of everything? Lister, what's your vote?" Lister looked up from practicing his imaginary pool shot.
"I vote for me."
Rimmer smirked, enjoying the game. 1-0 for Listypoos. I vote for Holly. 1-1. Criters.
"Well," said Crichton, "even though I agree it's insane and suicidal, I'm afraid I have to side with the human."
"Brutal!"
grinned Lister, and slapped the mechanoid on his shoulder.
"What?" said Rimmer. "You're voting for El Dirtball?"
"Sorry," said Crichton. "It's my programming."
Rimmer's smile receded like a fizzling fuse.
"Cat, I agree with you, buddy. Everything you said makes sense," the cat went on. "But the thing is, Even though I agree with you, I can never bring myself to vote for someone with your dress sense. I'm gonna vote for Lister.
3-1 to me, said Lister, and swayed his shoulders and rotated his fists into the touch-up shuffle. Lister ran the final check down on the Starbug's instrument panel, then flicked the intercom on so that Crichton's face appeared on the vidscreen. "We're ready to go, Crichton. Where's the cat?"
"He should be on his way, sir."
"This is madness." Rimmer shook his head, his eyes fixed on the Starbug's Navicom screen. "Sheer madness." There was a bleep, and the cat's face appeared next to Crichton's on the vidscreen.
"I'm not coming,"
he said. Lister bunched up his face. "What?"
"This is the way I see it. If everything goes okay, everyone's safe, no problem. If something goes wrong, the guys on Starbug get wiped out 20 minutes ahead of the guys on Red Dwarf.
So?
So, there's a lot of things a guy can do in 20 minutes. I'm staying here with Crichton."
"Thanks a lot." The cat grinned.
"Hey, don't even mention it. Just looking after number one."
Then he bleeped off the screen. The retro scorched into the takeoff pad, and the Starbug wobbled uneasily into the air. Lister frowned at the steering column. It seemed stiff and unresponsive. "What's the matter?" "Nothing," Lister lied. He wrestled the bug onto an even keel and fired the rear thrust jets. Rimmer glanced uneasily at the instrument panels. "What's happening? We're hardly moving." Then they were. The bug's tail plummeted to the ground, grinding huge sparks from the runway, while the nose bucked towards the cargo bay roof. Lister fought through his safety webbing and thumped the reheat button. The bug bobbed and reared before finally picking up speed, if not altitude. Nose in the air, tail on the ground, it screamed and grated the 1/4 mile towards the airlock doors. "I hardly need remind you," Rimmer yelled over the howling engines, "that we are carrying a small but robust thermonuclear device not 10 feet beneath us. In the name of everything that is holy, get this son of a goit in the air." "You think I'm doing this for a laugh?" Lister yelled. "There's something wrong. The ship feels about 10 times heavier than it should." The bug smacked into the rim of the airlock, flashing brilliant magnesium-white sparks that welded the doors open forever, and caromed out into the silent yawn of space. Once clear of the ship, the bug jerked and juddered, then plummeted for 2 miles down Red Dwarf's southwest face before Lister engaged the backup boosters and two-handedly wrestled the steering column into some semblance of submission. "I don't get it," Lister shouted over the engine's maximum howl. "For some reason, we need full thrust plus emergency backup just to get the smegging thing moving." Not for the first time, Rimmer felt extremely grateful he was already dead. Lister crouched over the flatbed scanner, one eye closed, his nose almost parallel with the screen. Silent and still, he studied the 3D simulation, then straightened and walked around the table to look at it from a new angle. There, at the far end of the screen, was the blue ice planet. This was the planet Lister had designated as the Blue Ball. To the right, circling around the bigger of the twin suns, was the planet Lister had christened the Cue Ball. The cue ball would strike the blue ball and send it into the orbit of the left-hand sun, or, as Lister preferred to call it, the pocket. That simple. It was a straightforward pot. He'd made identical shots thousands of times before. True, he'd never made the shot with planets, but, as Lister kept on insisting, in theory it should be easier because planets are bigger. Without taking his eyes from the scanner, he grabbed a 6-pack of double-strength lager out of Starbug's tiny fridge and ripped off a ring pull. He was halfway through his 3rd can before Rimmer broke his vow of silence. "How many of those are you going to drink?" "I told you not to talk. Game on." He finished the 3rd and started the 4th. "You're going to drink 4 cans of double-strength lager?" Lister brushed some imaginary dust from the scanner screen.
"No, I'm going to drink all 6. I always play me best pool when I've had a few beers. Steadies the nerves. I'm not going to get blasted, just nicely drunk."
Define nicely drunk. Is nicely drunk horizontal or perpendicular?
"Rimmer, I can handle it."
I'm not sure I can.
"We're in the wrong position."
Lister sucked at his can.
"It's an easier shot if we're over here."
He tapped the screen at a point midway between Red Dwarf and the oncoming planet. You mean right in the path of the ice planet? Lister nodded. So, if you miss, we get a planet in our face.
"I'm not going to miss."
Lister tugged open his 5th lager and ducked down into Starbug's cockpit section. Mish?
"What?"
You said mish. I'm not going to mish, you said. You're pissed. Lister fired up the thrusters and wrenched the bug towards its new coordinates.
"God, I could murder a curry. Pity we didn't bring any food. Have we got any crisps or anything?"
The planet was close now. It occupied almost half of Rimmer's Navicomp screen and was growing steadily in size as it thundered towards them. Lister screwed up the empty 6th can of lager and threw it across the room at the waste bin. It hit the rim and clattered onto the floor. Rimmer closed his eyes. Let's just get out of here! It's a shame about the Cat and Crichton, but we still have a chance to save our necks. Lister flicked the missile launch to manual. The firing pad lurched forward from the flatbed scanner, and he nestled his nose into the bifocal viewer. Heat prickled his arms and his forehead. He lined up the crosswires on the sun around which the Q planet spun. He shifted his legs until he felt his center of balance. It was lined up. It looked right. But he waited. He waited until it felt right. Then it felt right. Space faded away, and he was back in the Egbert arms, and this was just another shot to stay on the table. He was on the 8th ball, and all it needed was a push, with just enough bottom to avoid the in-off. It was easy. He could do it. It felt right. He played his shot. He touched the launch button and increased the pressure steadily and evenly in one smooth movement. With a primal scream, the missile ripped from its housing under Starbug's belly and sizzled towards the distant sun. Lister turned to the scanner screen and watched. The whole sequence took 8 hours to play out, but to Rimmer it seemed like 8 years. To Lister it seemed like 8 seconds. The missile plunged into the sun's inferno, and a giant solar flare licked up from its raging surface, struck Lister's Q-planet, and slammed it out of orbit. The Q-planet yammered through space towards the intersection coordinates, the point where it would collide with the ice planet and knock it into the pocket of the left-hand sun. Almost immediately, Rimmer realized it was going to miss, and not by a little, by a lot. The Q-planet wasn't going to hit the ice planet. It wasn't even going to connect. The Q-planet had been wrenched from its orbit hopelessly early. It was going to streak harmlessly across the path of the oncoming ice world to be captured in orbit around the left-hand sun. Lister had sunk the Q-ball. Or rather, he was going to sink the Q-ball. First they had to wait for the planetary pull shot to run its slow-motion course. They didn't exchange a word for 3 hours. They watched the scanner screen and hoped, against the evidence of their eyes, that it wouldn't happen. But it did. The Q-planet flew into orbit around the opposite sun. It looped round the far side in an erratic ellipse, then thumped into the sun's resident planet, and sent that curling out into space. The resident planet swept across the scanner screen, cannoned into the ice world, and hammered it into the orbit of the right-hand sun, before elegantly backspinning a return path to its original position. "She rides!" Lister wiggled his hips and arms in a touch-up shuffle. "She rides!" "You jammy bastard!" "Played for and got!" He pumped the air with his fists, chanting rhythmically. "Yes, yes, yes, yes!" "You jammy bastard!" "How can that be jammy? I pocketed all 3 planets with one stroke. How can that be a fluke?" "You're trying to tell me it was deliberate?" "Obviously I wasn't going to tell you I was going for the trick shot. You'd have had one of your spasms." "Oh, do smeg off." Lister started dancing around the flatbed scanner, waving a 7th can of double-strength lager. "Pool god!" He baptized himself with beer. "King of the Qs!" He thumped his chest. "Prince of the Planet Potters!" Lister was doing some serious damage to his third six-pack and watching the fast-motion replay on the scanner for the 171st time while Rimmer slept off the journey back to Red Dwarf in the bug's one and only sleep couch, when a planet hit them. Which planet hit them, Lister never discovered. In fact, it was the Q planet, which had been knocked out of its new orbit by the backspinning resident planet. But that didn't really concern Lister. When the craft you're in gets hit by a planet, you rarely have the presence of mind to stop and swap insurance details. Technically, the bug wasn't actually hit by the planet. It was the planet's slipstream. But that was enough to flick the craft upside down and send it on a corkscrew death dive towards the ice world. Only the Starbug's dome-shaped drive section, scorched black from its encounter with the ice planet's stratosphere, poked up through the slow-shifting sea of snow dunes. Resting against the foot of the glacier, it fizzled and steamed for almost 5 days in the unrelenting blizzard before there was any sign of life. Finally, the small hatchway chinked open, and light gushed out into the black Arctic night. Lister's face, encircled by parka fur, appeared grimacing in the opening. His gloved fingers folded around the rim of the hatchway before the blinding wind forced back the door and tried to close it on his head. The back of his skull slammed against the metal edging of the doorframe while the steel hatch jammed into his nose and began the slow business of cutting his head in two. He was helpless and close to blacking out. He was beginning to think that after all he'd been through, being dawed to death was a stupid way to die, when the wind changed direction for a second time and the hatchway gave to his frantic pushes. He fell out of the bug and teetered on a ledge of packed snow. He quickly discovered the only way to remain upright was to lean into the wind. He had to incline his body at an angle of 50 degrees. He felt absurd, but there was no other way of staying on his feet. He managed 3 steps at this angle before the blizzard inflated his parka hood and knocked him off the ledge. He slithered down the bank and dropped into the trough cut by Starbug's crash path. Gradually he hauled himself to his feet and unfastened the small ship-issue snow trowel which was tied to his waist. He looked at it. It measured scarcely 4 inches across. He looked at what little of the bug was visible above the drift. At a rough estimate, he would have to shift about 800 tons of snow if the bug was ever to move. He tried 2 trowelfuls before the erratic blizzard swirled into the trough and tossed him like a broken kite into a snowbank 50 feet away. Rimmer stooped over the communications console and barked into the microphone. "Mayday! Mayday! Can you read me? Come in, please!" He looked up at the screen, which continued to rasp its static gibberish. The Starbug's inner door hammered open, and a blizzard stumbled in, followed by Lister. The snow swirled around inside the craft like a swarm of trapped insects looking for an escape. Lister hurled himself against the inner door and fought it closed. Rimmer didn't look up from the communicator. "Still snowing, is it?"
"It's useless."
Lister flung his gloves against the bug's far bulkhead.
"You can hardly stand up, never mind dig it out."
He sneered at the static on the screen. 5 days had gone by, broadcasting on all frequencies, and still Red Dwarf hadn't acknowledged the SOS. Rimmer persisted. "Mayday! Mayday!" Lister took the rum bottle from his parka's emergency pocket, spun off the top, and tilted it to his lips. The alcohol was frozen solid. Holding the neck, he smashed the bottle on the corner of the table and gratefully sucked his rum lollipop. This was the last alcohol on board. He was beginning to panic. If they didn't get rescued soon, he might have to spend a night with Rimmer, sober. "Mayday! Mayday!" Rimmer turned. "I wonder why it's Mayday." "Eh?" "The distress call. Why do you say Mayday? It's just a bank holiday. Why not Shrove Tuesday or Ascension Sunday?" He turned back to the communicator. "Ascension Sunday! Ascension Sunday!" He thought for a while, and then tried, "The 14th Wednesday after Pentecost! The 14th Wednesday after Pentecost!" It's French, you doink. Help me. Mayday. How much food is there?
Rimmer nodded at the navigation console. I made a full list on the dictopad. Lister picked up Rimmer's voice-activated electronic diary and pressed play. The menu was meagre indeed. Half a bag of smoky bacon crisps, a tin of mustard powder, a brown lemon, 3 stale water biscuits, 2 bottles of vinegar, and a tube of Bonjela gum ointment. Lister looked up from the pad.
Gum ointment.
I found it in the first aid box. It's that minty flavour. It's quite nice.
It's quite nice if you smear it on your mouth, Ulcer, but you can't sit down and eat it.
Rimmer raised an eyebrow. You may have to.
Is that it? Nothing else?
Just a pot noodle. Oh, and I found a tin of dog food on the tool shelf. Misery hissed through Lister's gritted teeth.
Well,
he said finally.
Pretty obvious what gets eaten last. I can't stand pot noodles.
He huddled over the last remnants of fuel glowing in the mining brazier and tried not to think of food. 3 days had passed since he'd unzipped the last of the emergency seal meals. 3 days without proper food. In fact, he hadn't eaten at all since breakfast the previous morning, and that had only been a raw sprout and a piece of chewing gum he'd found stuck under the drive seat. It was all right for Rimmer. Rimmer was a hologram. He didn't have to eat. He couldn't feel the cold. He couldn't die. He replayed the food list again, desperately searching for something vaguely palatable. Rimmer argued that most of the food groups were represented. Vitamins, proteins, nutrients. If Lister paced himself, Rimmer pointed out, if he sat down and worked out a dietary program and stuck to it, the food could last him for 2 weeks. But, as Lister pointed out, Rimmer held that opinion because he was a dork. The argument ended in a long silence, broken only by the fizzling of the screen and the crackling of the brazier. It was Lister who spoke first. Predictably, he said,
God, I'm so hungry.
Stop thinking about food.
Take me mind off it, then talk about something.
Like what?
Anything.
Anything?
Anything apart from food.
Rimmer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Not small talk. He hated it. Like what?
I dunno,
Lister shrugged.
Tell me how you lost your virginity.
Rimmer yawned to conceal his panic.
Well, it was so long ago. I was so young and sexually precocious. I'm not sure I can remember. Everyone can remember how they lost their virginity.
Well, I don't. Good grief, you can hardly expect me to recall every single sexual liaison I've ever partaken of. What do you think I am, the memory man? Rimmer was babbling to buy himself thinking time. He'd always been a bit of a fish out of water when it came to women. Frankly, he'd always had a rather low sex drive, which he secretly ascribed to all the school cabbage he was forced to eat as a boy. What was a respectable age to claim he'd lost it? Certainly not 31. To a half-concussed flight technician who checked herself out of the recovery bay prematurely after a winch had fallen on her head, who was still wearing the bandages and was so disorientated she kept on calling him Alan. Certainly not that magical and lovely moment balanced precariously on the rim of the sleeping quarters sink. No, he must lie. But what lie? He had to macho the facts up a bit. What was a good age for a tough, sexually potent, rough-and-tumble type astro to have his cherry popped? Mid-20s? Early 20s?
Come on, Rimmer. The truth.
Then Rimmer remembered his first fumbled encounter at second base. He was 19. A slight tweaking of the facts, a slight blurring of the action, and that should be perfectly respectable. The first time, the very first time, was this girl I met at cadet college, Sandra. We were both 19. We did it in the back of my brother's car.
What was it like?
Oh, fantastic, brilliant. Rimmer's eyes acquired a milky hue, and his mouth went dry. Bentley convertible, V8 turbo, walnut burr paddling. Beautiful machine, beautiful. So what about you? How did you lose yours?
Michelle Fisher. The 9th hole of Bootle Municipal Golf Course. Par 4, dogleg to the right and the bunker behind the green.
On a golf course? Lister nodded. A golf course? How old were you?
Lister wistfully prodded the dying coals in the brazier. She took all her clothes off and just stood there in front of me, completely naked. I was so excited I nearly dropped my skateboard.
Your skateboard? How old were you?
12.
12? 12 years old? When you lost your virginity, you were 12?
Yeah.
12?
Rimmer stared into the fire.
Well, you can't have been a full member of the golf club then.
Course I wasn't.
You did it on a golf course and you weren't a member?
Course I wasn't, Lister repeated.
So you didn't pay any green fees or anything?
It was just a place to go.
I used to play golf. I hate people who abuse the facilities. I hope you raked the sand back nicely before you left. That'd be a hell of a lie to get into, wouldn't it? Competition the next day and your ball lands in Lister's buttock crevice. You'd need more than a niblick to get that one out.
Are you trying to say I've got a big bum?
Big? It's like 2 badly parked Volkswagens.
12? Rimmer couldn't believe it. The only thing he'd ever lost when he was 12 were his Space Scout shoes, with the compass in the heel and the animal tracks on the soles. His best friend, the boy who bullied him least, Porky Roebuck, threw them in the septic tank behind the sports ground. He'd cried for weeks. He'd been wearing them. Suddenly, the communications console crackled into life. The screen resolved itself into a clear picture, and Crichton was talking to them. But something was wrong with the sound. All they could hear was a dull, resonant bass throb, a slow-motion growl. Lister played with the frequency controls, but couldn't improve the sound reception. The transmission never varied. Crichton's expression never appeared to change, and the deep, undulating grunt from the speakers never relented. They checked the video link, but could find nothing wrong. Same with the speakers. They were functioning perfectly. Then something happened to Rimmer. It was hardly noticeable at first, but after a couple of hours it was plain that he'd started slowing down. There was a definite time lag in his responses to Lister. Talking to him was like conducting a transatlantic phone conversation with a bad connection. His light image started to corrupt. Occasionally he would flash and become two-dimensional or lose all colour. Lister didn't mention it at first. It seemed rude somehow. Rimmer had always been extremely sensitive about his status as a hologram. He hated to be reminded that his image was projected from a minute light bee which hovered in his centre and from time to time went wrong. Frequently in the past he'd suffered glitches, becoming slightly transparent or turning a strange shade of blue. On one occasion his legs had become separated from the rest of his body, and spent a morning wandering aimlessly about the ship, leaving his torso shaking its fist in fury. As a rule, Lister never remarked on these signal failings, and within hours they were generally put right. But this was different. Rimmer's voice had dropped 2 octaves, and trying to hold a conversation with him was like talking person to Paul Robeson on Mars. "Rimmer? What's happening?" A 2-minute pause, then... "Don't... No... Something must be wrong with your signals from the ship. The remote's hologrammatic relay's not getting through properly." "Can't... understand when you speak so fast. Speak normally, like me." The conversation that followed was brief in content, but took the best part of half a day to complete. The essence of the dialogue was that the signal from the ship that projected Rimmer's image was slowing down and weakening. When the signal became too faint to transmit, the hologrammatic projection unit would automatically flick from remote to local, and Rimmer would be regenerated fully functional back on Red Dwarf.
Well, that's good. You can find out what's keeping them. Tell them where I am.
Rimmer nodded curtly. It took 5 minutes. The transmission grew weaker. Interference lines split up Rimmer's image for minutes on end.
I'll be back,
he said over the course of the next half hour.
Trust me.
Rimmer blipped off and reformed in the hologrammatic projection unit regeneration chamber aboard Red Dwarf. Instantly, he knew something was wrong. But not with him, with time. Lister had his first meal in 4 days, 16 hours after Rimmer had vanished. He sat in front of the brazier and looked down at the grey, chipped enamel of the ship issue plate. The meal almost looked nice. It was garnished with potato crisps, topped by crumbled water biscuits, sprinkled with mustard, and decorated with flower twirls of Bungella gum ointment. But it was still dog food. It was still rich, chunky lumps of rabbit in a thick marrowbone jelly. It was still utterly revolting. A dozen times he dug in his fork and held the quivering mass centimetres from his lips, but he just couldn't bring himself to put it in his mouth and swallow. If it had had a neutral smell, it might have been all right, but the smell of dog food had always filled Lister with nausea. After disco urinals, his own socks, and Spanish perfume, it was his least favourite smell. So he waited. He waited until he was so hungry he didn't care. Until the dog food wasn't dog food. Until it was a prime slab of fillet steak sizzling in a creamy, fresh blue cheese sauce. With the pinched eyes of a gourmet sampling perfection, he slid the wobbling forkful between his lips. He chewed a bit more. Then he swallowed the dog food. He sat for a while. Well, he thought, now I know why dogs lick their testicles. It's to get rid of the taste of the food. He placed the fork back on the plate, rose and staggered uneasily to the starbug's tail section to try and take his mind off eating. He opened up the locker that stored the bug's tiny library and tried to find some distraction. It was no good. Everything reminded him of food. He glanced down the spines, Charles Lamb, Sir Francis Bacon, and his eyes started playing tricks. Herman Wock, he read, and The Caretaker by Harold Pinter. He saw food everywhere, even when it wasn't there. Eric van Lustbader, Eric Van, bread van, meat van, food. There was nothing else for it. He returned to the vessel's midsection, finished off the dog food, curled up, and fell happily asleep. He awoke to the sound of creaking metal and running water. He unzipped his sleep bag. His clothes were wet. He was sweating. There was a crash, and he was flung across the cabin. The bug was tilting. Cupboards and lockers hurled themselves open and disgorged their contents over the warm metal deck. Lister clattered to his feet and tried to scramble up the incline and into the cockpit, but the bug lurched again and sent him tumbling through the back hatchway and into the tail section. Then Starbug started to move. Slowly at first, it slid lazily backwards, its outer hull grinding against the landscape, fins and support legs bending and snapping as it went. Lister clawed his way up the ship and staggered to a viewport window. Iceworld was melting. Overnight, its ice age was ending. The warm kiss of its new sun was thawing the planet which had been frozen for countless millennia. Thick grey rivers gushed down the faces of shrinking glaciers. Mountains were moving, gliding with majestic grace across the liquid landscape. And Starbug was picking up speed, skidding helplessly downhill. Lister collapsed to his haunches, hurled his head into his hands, and made strange moaning sounds. He was sick of it. All he wanted to do was go home. Get back to Earth. Find a dead-end job and live out the rest of a boring existence. But no, from Mimas to deep space to unreality to this. Marooned in a smashed-up spacecraft that was tobogganing down a glacier with only 3 squirts of gum ointment and half a bottle of vinegar between him and starvation. Under the circumstances, Lister did the only sane thing. He went back to bed. Lister had a gift for sleeping. He could sleep anywhere, at any time, in any circumstances. It was a much underestimated talent in his view, and if they'd ever held world sleeping competitions in his time back on Earth, he could have been an international somnolist. He could have slept for his country. He crawled back to the bunk, bent his pillow in a U around his ears, and became the first man ever to sleep through a melting ice age. Something was wrong with time. Rimmer stepped out of the regeneration booth into the long corridor of the hologram projection suite. The banks of machinery that lined the half-mile wall rippled and undulated as if light itself were bending. To Rimmer's right, at the far end of the suite, a glass water cooler had toppled free of its housing and appeared to be defying gravity, suspended halfway between the countertop and the floor. He lurched right and started walking towards it. This turned out to be a mistake. As he raised his left leg and thrust it forward, it telescoped out 40 feet down the room. Instinctively, he flicked out his right leg to retain his balance, but his right leg bolted down the room, overtaking his left. He stopped and looked at his position. His head and torso appeared to be barely 2 feet off the ground, while his right leg was 80 feet down the room and his left leg still 40. He stayed perfectly still and wondered what to do. The water cooler had moved a few inches closer to the floor. He leant forward, and his neck elongated out of his shoulders, so he looked like a bipedal brontosaurus, and zoomed off down the room. He panicked and started to chase after his neck. Suddenly, he was aware that something was overtaking him at speed. It was his right leg. Once again it stretched yards in front of him. Then a flash of khaki from the other side, and his other leg loomed out to join it. It took 3 more rubbery steps until a bout of nausea forced him to stop. The water cooler was definitely moving. The closer Rimmer got, the faster it moved. He turned back and looked down the room towards a digital wall clock. The minute digits were hammering over so fast they were little more than a blur. Rimmer started to head back for the door at the clock end to make his way to the ship's status room. To his alarm, he found that thrusting his legs out in this direction made them shrink. They concertinaed into themselves so he looked like a bad impression of Groucho Marx chasing after Margaret Dumont. Something was happening to the clock. The nearer he got to it, the slower it appeared to move. The digits were still flicking over at high speed, but it was a slower high speed than the speed he'd witnessed when he'd been standing by the suspended water cooler. Finally, he reached the end of the suite and stood under the clock. Now it was moving perfectly normally. The digits read Monday, 1302. He walked through the hatchway and stood in the main linking corridor. The corridor ran at a right angle to the hologram suite and appeared to be normal. The problem, whatever it was, seemed to be localized to the one room. He started to head for the status room. His right leg thumped down, short, wide, and elephantine, while his left tapered elegantly out beside him. He waddled on his 2 strange new legs into the status room, sat down at the console desk, and scanned the bank of security monitors. The problem was ship-wide. Time was moving at different speeds in every single room. He glanced down at the digital clock nestled among the console switches. The readout was Tuesday, 05:17. 200 yards down the corridor, it was Monday afternoon. Here, it was Tuesday morning. He voice-activated the external viewport scanners and studied the screens. Rimmer could see nothing outside the ship that would explain the phenomenon. The 2 suns of the binary systems were still here, and so were the 3 planets. The only slightly odd thing was that one of the suns, the sun that lay to the front of the ship, was no longer perfectly round. It was now egg-shaped, and a thin stream of light peeled off it, tailing away into the blackness. The sun, far off into the distance, around which Lister's planet orbited, seemed unaffected. Rimmer voice-activated the monitors back to internal and scrutinized the images more closely. It took him nearly an hour to work it out. The closer you got to the front of the ship, the slower time was moving. It was as if some gigantic force were sucking in time, corrupting it, slowing it down. There were only two things Rimmer knew of that could produce such a syndrome. And since he'd never in his life consumed a magic mushroom, that left only one alternative. He prayed he was wrong. He was wrong about most things, and always had been. Why should he be right about this? No, there was some option he hadn't considered. He was bound to be wrong. Bound to be. He cheered up a little, confident in his own awesome capacity for incompetence, and asked the security computer to activate a sweep search for Crichton and the cat. It found them in one of the engine rooms to the rear of the ship, frantically chasing around with a battalion of scutters, trying to restart the engines. Rimmer called for a voice link. "Crichton? Lister's marooned on the ice planet. He's starving to death. We've got to get down and help him. What the smeg's happening?" Crichton replied in a garbled falsetto before he was barged out of shop by the cat, who was clearly impatient to deliver his own version of the facts. "Gubba-dubba-dee!" he squeaked, his hands gesticulating wildly, like a deranged street drunk. "Gada-bada-bada-beetle-beeta, okay?"
"Speak slowly,"
said Rimmer, as quick and high-pitched as he could.
"I have to speak fast and squeaky, and you have to speak slow and low, otherwise we won't make sense of each other."
Crichton blinked into the video shot and spoke as slowly as he could. He still sounded like a man with a mouthful of helium, but at least now it was intelligible.
Something is wrong,
he chirruped helpfully.
"Oh, really?"
Rimmer squeaked back sarcastically.
"How enlightening. It's Tuesday in here, Monday next door, and you think something's wrong."
What are you talking about?
Crichton said.
It's Friday.
He twisted the security camera so it pointed at the wall clock.
"Friday?"
Rimmer squinted at the readout.
"It's Monday next door, Tuesday in here, and Friday where you are."
He sat and thought.
"But which Friday? Is it last Friday or next Friday?"
It's this Friday,
said Crichton.
"What's the date?"
15th.
"So it's a week next Friday."
There was a hiatus. Nobody could think of anything to say.
"I'm coming down,"
Rimmer said finally.
"I'll be there in a sec."
At last!
The cat turned from testing the final piston housing and stood, hands on hips, in his red silk boiler suit with gold trimming.
Where have you been, buddy?
I ran all the way, Rimmer panted. I can't have been more than 5 minutes.
You've been over a week.
Rimmer glanced at the clock. It was Saturday the 23rd. Crichton's head poked round the corner of the piston housing.
We're ready and primed,
he said.
Let's start the engines.
The three of them lumbered uneasily up the spiral staircase and into the Navicomp suite. Crichton stabbed in the startup sequence, and the massive pistons smashed the engine into life. Crichton clapped his plastic hands in delight.
Oh, we did it!
Okay.
The cat slid out of his silk boiler suit, revealing a quilted lame jumpsuit underneath.
Slip this baby in the reverse and let's scoot.
Crichton typed in the appropriate sequence, and the engine noise changed pitch, becoming a strangulated thudding whine. 3 pairs of eyes fixed on the speed bearing readout. It scarcely changed.
More power,
said the cat.
Get that pedal and the metal. Sluice that juice.
We're on full reverse thrust.
The cat shouldered Crichton out of the way and jabbed pointlessly at the controls.
It cannot be, novelty condom head. We're still moving forwards.
Look!
Crichton pointed at the display.
We're into the red. We're using all the power we've got.
It's true, then. Rimmer slumped into the console chair.
What's true?
Said the cat. What's true, Rimmer looked up, red-eyed with fear, is that we're being sucked into a black hole. Today was the day. Today was the big one. John Yu had been doing the Jovian run for the best part of 20 years. Not many people were prepared to spend their life ferrying human sewage from Jupiter's satellites all the way across the solar system and dropping it on the dump planet. But John Yu actually enjoyed his work, and what's more, it paid well. It wasn't just sewage that was disgorged on the dump planet, it was everything. All humankind's garbage. Nuclear waste, chemical effluents, rotting foodstuffs, glass waste, waste paper, every kind of trash, all the unwanted byproducts of 3,000 years of civilization. But John Yu specialized in sewage. He was the king of crap. And right now, he was sitting on top of 2 billion tons of it. His tiny control dome, the only inhabitable section of the vast haulage ship, made up less than 1% of the gigantic structure. The bulk of the craft was given over to the twin 2-mile-long cylinders that stored the waste. The ship's computer indicated they were about to go into orbit. Yu climbed into his safety webbing and switched on the view screen. The refuse ship powered through the thin atmosphere and hit the thick, choking black smog that spiraled up from the planet's surface. And there it was. Garbage world. Whole land masses were given over to particular types of waste. For 20 minutes the ship flew over a range of a dozen mountains composed entirely of discarded tin cans. So high the peaks were capped with snow. It passed over an island the size of the Malagasy Republic, piled high with decomposing black bin bags. It flew over a fermenting sea, flaming with toxic waste. It skimmed over an entire continent of wrecked cars, thousands upon thousands of miles of rusting chassis. It crossed a desert, a vast, featureless flatland of cigarette dimps. And then it arrived at the continent for sewage. This was the moment he'd been planning for almost 2 decades. Like anyone else in a dull job, John Yu made up games to help pass the time. His game was graffiti. And he was about to complete the biggest single piece of graffito ever attempted in the history of civilization. It sprawled across a continent. It was visible from space. It was written in effluence, and it said, "You was 'ere." Today, he had the final 2 billion tons he required to complete the half-finished loop of the final E. The bay doors on the belly of the ship hinged open, and the effluents poured down and splattered into place. John Yu unhooked himself from the safety harness and swaggered down the thin aisle, the cleft of his buttocks wobbling hairily over the top of his jeans. He flicked on the satellite link and examined his masterpiece in its completed glory. He scratched his hairy shoulders and belched,
"Beautiful."
John Yu was a colonial. He'd been born and raised on Ganymede, one of the moons that spun around Jupiter. He was aware that his ancestors had once lived here. In fact, they had originated from the dump planet. But no one at all had lived there for 5 or 6 generations. He felt no affinity for the world of his forebears any more than Anglo-Saxons felt an affinity for Scandinavia. Earth didn't really mean anything to you. It was just there to be dumped on. The mathematics was simple. Civilization produces garbage. The greater the civilization, the greater the garbage. And humankind had become very civilized indeed. 300 years after the invention of the light bulb, they'd colonized the entire solar system. The solar system was soon jam-packed with civilization too, and humankind rapidly reached the point where there was so much indestructible garbage, there was nowhere left to put it. Something had to be done. Firing the garbage willy-nilly off into space was cost-prohibitive. So the Interplanetary Commission for Waste Disposal conducted a series of feasibility studies, and they concluded that one of the 9 planets of the solar system had to be given over to waste. Delegates from all the planets and their satellites submitted tenders to lose the contract. The Mercurian delegation pointed to their solar energy plants, which provided cheap, limitless energy for the whole system. The study group from Uranus hinged its case on its natural stores of mineral deposits. Jupiter and its moons relied on their outstanding natural beauty. Neptune built its case on famous planetary architecture. It had been terraformed to the highest specifications. Saturn's rings, a massive tourist attraction, made that planet safe, and its network of moons, though often seedy and down-market, generated a lot of business merely because of their position along established trade routes. Mars was the safest of all, because it was home to the wealthy. It was the chicest, most exclusive world in the planetary system, handy for commuting to other planets, yet far enough away from the riffraff to be ideal for the mega-rich. Venus took the Martian overspill, the people who wanted to live on Mars but couldn't quite afford it. Venus was full of people who wanted to be Martians, so much so they often quoted their address as South Mars or Mars-Venus borders. Still, it was a fairly wealthy planet, and the Venusians constituted a powerful political lobby. And so it became a straight battle between Earth and Pluto. The Plutonian delegation made a rather weak case, drawing attention to their planet's erratic orbit and its position on the edge of the solar system. The Earth delegation was beside itself with fury. Frankly, it was outraged that the planet that was mother to the human race, where life itself had been spawned and nurtured, was even being considered for such a putrid fate. It talked long and heatedly about how humankind had to remember its roots, and showed long, dull videos of Earth's past beauty. Of course, it conceded, the planet wasn't as pulchritudinous as it had once been. Yes, it agreed, it was now the most polluted planet in the solar system. True, most of the inhabitants had fled to the new terraformed worlds, and it was home now to only a handful of millions too broke, too scared, or too stupid to leave. But what about tradition, it argued? Earth had invented civilization. It had given civilization to the solar system. If civilization now turned round and literally dumped on Earth, what did that say about humankind? And so it came to the vote. The vote was telecast live to every terraformed world in the solar system. A jury on each of the worlds sat patiently through all 9 presentations, and then allocated points, the lowest points going to the planet most favoured for the new mantle of Garbage World. The show was broadcast from the French settlement of Dion, the Saturnian satellite. It was hosted by Avril Dupont, the greatly loved French TV star.
Hello, Mercury?
Pause. Crackle. Hello, Avril.
Can you give us the votes for the Mercurian jury?
Here are the votes of the Mercurian jury. Pluto, 2 points.
Pluto, 2 points. La Pluton, 2 points.
Neptune, 7 points.
Neptune, 7 points. Le Neptune, 7 points.
Uranus, 4 points.
Uranus, 4 points. L'Uranus, 4 points.
Saturn, 8 points.
Saturn, 8 points. Le Saturn, 8 points.
Jupiter, 5 points.
Jupiter, 5 points. La Jupiter, 5 points.
Mars, 12 points.
Mars, 12 points. La Mars, 12 points.
Venus, 10 points.
Venus, 10 points. La Venus, 10 points.
Earth, no points.
Earth, no points. La Terre, 0 points.
And that concludes the voting of the Mercurian jury. Good night, Avril. And that was the best score Earth got. It culled not one single vote. At 11:20, on the 11th of November the following year, the last shuttle load of evacuees left for rehousing on Pluto, and the planet Earth was officially renamed Garbage World. The president of Callisto personally cut the ribbon of toilet paper, ceremonially deposited the first symbolic shovelful of horse manure in the center of what once had been Venice, and declared Garbage World open for business. The president and his aides dashed into the presidential shuttle as the first wave of 300,000 refuse ships swooped down and dumped their stinking loads on the planet that was once called Earth. The dumping areas were strictly regulated. North America, for instance, was bottles, clear bottles on the west coast, brown bottles on the east, and green in the centre. Australia was reserved for domestic waste, potato peelings, soiled paper nappies, used tea bags, banana skins, squeezed toothpaste tubes. Japan became the graveyard of the motor car. From island to island, from tip to tail, from Datsuns to Chryslers to 40-cylinder cyclotronic hovercars, dead, silent metal covered the land of the setting sun. The Arctic Circle was allocated rotting foodstuffs. The Bahamas was home to old sofas and bicycle wheels. Korea took all broken electrical equipment. Europe got the sewage. And over the last 20 years, John Yu had busied himself signing his name over the corner of that once great continent. John Yu shut down the satellite link and followed his hairy beer belly back to the front of the ship. Before he could reach the safety webbing, a massive pocket of methane turbulence rocked the refuse craft and sent him staggering into the first aid box. He fingered the gash that grinned bloodily on his brow and invented 2 new swear words. The methane storms had been getting worse over the past few years, and he knew he should have consulted the meteorological computer before he ventured from his safety harness. As he lurched to his feet, a second methane blast hit the ship under its belly, sending him stumbling back down the narrow aisle. As he slithered helplessly backwards, his flailing arm caught the door release mechanism, and the cockpit's emergency exit swung open. His fat fingers scrambled for a handhold, but found nothing until he slid through the open doorway, and he grabbed the rim of the footledge. For 30 seconds he dangled, screaming, over Europe. Then he dangled no more. He plunged from the yawning garbage ship and drowned in his own signature. "You was 'ere," it said. And it was right, he was. The unmanned craft hacked around wildly in the sudden turbulence. The autopilot stretched beyond its capacity. The methane storm whipped up to hurricane force and sucked the ship to the ground. A continent of methane exploded. The blast triggered off a thermonuclear reaction in 1,000 discarded atomic power stations, and the Earth tore itself from its orbit around the sun and farted its way out of the solar system. 2,500 years of abuse were ended. The Earth was free. Free from humankind. Free from civilization. When it was clear of the sun's influence, it froze in heatless space and bathed its wounds in a perennial ice age. On it went, out of the solar system and into deep space, carving a path through the universe, looking for a new sun to call home. Lister coughed himself awake. A gargantuan coughing fit forced his body into a ball and thrashed it about under the heavy quilting of the sleep sheet before his head finally emerged from under the covers, gasping for air. Air, it turned out, was the last thing he wanted. It was thick and smoky and bitter to the taste. His hands scrambled blindly for the bunkside oxygen mask that dangled above the recessed sleeping couch. He held it to his face and sucked. Gradually his vision cleared, and he peeked out into the murk. There was a hissing sound coming from the floor. Lister drew the blanket around him, knelt up and craned over the side of the couch to get a closer look. The whole of the steel alloy deck was pitted with thin, deep, smoking holes, as if something were trying to burrow up into the craft from below. As he watched, something flitted past his face, almost brushing his cheek, landed in a loud fizzle on the deck, and started to tunnel patiently through the reinforced steel. Lister snapped his head back into the shelter of the recess. His heart thumped a samba on the xylophone of his ribs. That could have been his head. He ducked low, so the edge of Starbug's roof edged into his field of vision. Hollow metal stalactites hung down from the buckled structure, some of them dripping a clear, colourless liquid onto the bug's floor. Lister shot back and huddled in the corner of the recess. Acid rain. But not normal acid rain. This was acid rain. Acid rain of such concentration it cut through high-density metal as if it were full-fat soft cheese. His eyes lit on what remained of the high-backed scanner-scope chair. It was now a pile of steaming gloop.
Only 2 nights earlier, he'd fallen asleep on that chair. That gloop could have been him. It didn't make sense. Why hadn't the acid rain cut through the bunk roof? Why had that held out? Lister looked up and got his answer. It hadn't. The roof bulged crazily like a balloon full of water, and stalactites of corrupted metal pointed their long, threatening fingers down towards him. There was nowhere to go, no haven. Whatever Lister decided to do, he had to do it fast. He grabbed his boots from the locker behind his head and laced them frantically, keeping his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Suddenly, the area of roof just above his head started to give way. Lister rolled off the bunk, taking the mattress with him, and swung into the bunk below. Within minutes, stalactites had begun to tongue down through the roof of the new bunk. He guessed that he had about 2 minutes before the acid came through. But 2 minutes to do what? To go where? Up was unthinkable. Out? No way. No choice then. Down. He ripped at the wooden slats underneath the lower bunk's mattress. If only he could get down to the maintenance deck below. At least it would buy him some time. He piled the slats behind him and peered down into the hole. Lister really didn't expect to find an access hatch leading straight down to the maintenance deck smack under the bunks, but it still surprised him when he didn't. He was shocked. He was offended. True, the chances of there being one were tiny. Why would anyone in their right mind build an access hatch underneath 2 bunks? What for, apart from providing a handy escape route for any spacefarer who happened to get caught in a particularly nasty downpour of acid rain? But on the other hand, there had to be one. Otherwise, there was no way out. Otherwise, he was dead. So when there wasn't one, frankly, he was outraged. He was furious. There could have been a below-bunk access hatch for dozens of reasons. A long-forgotten, disused cleaning hatch, an air-conditioning access point, a ventilation shaft. The craft was crammed full of them. Why couldn't there be one here? But there wasn't. There was nothing but featureless flooring. He scratched futilely at the smooth metal, then smashed 3 wooden slats to splinters without even marking the doubly reinforced floor that separated him from the maintenance deck. Now what? Lister jammed his back against the corner of the bunk and crammed his knees against his chest. He wrapped his knuckles around one of the wooden slats by his side and jabbed it up into the metal base of the bunk above at a 45-degree angle from his body. Then he jabbed again, and again. The slat slid through the softened steel, and the acid from the bunk above began to trickle down into the feet end of the lower bunk. Lister held the oxygen mask to his face and jabbed again, widening the drain hole above him. He withdrew the blackened, smoking slat and jabbed again. More acid gushed in through the widening gap, melting its way towards the maintenance deck below. There was nothing to do but wait and see which would give first, the base of the bunk above him or the escape hole below. There was a creaking sound, and the bunk ceiling lurched dangerously and ballooned down another 2 inches towards his head. He stabbed frantically at the floor and wiggled the slat ferociously to increase the hole's diameter. 9 inches wide, now a foot, still too small. Suddenly there was a screaming pain in his hand, in the fatty flesh between his thumb and forefinger. He held it up to his face. The acid had burnt straight through, leaving a smoking peephole. He could see through his hand. The escape hole was 15 inches wide. He tossed the slat into the gap and waited for it to hit the deck below. 1 little second, 2 little seconds, 3 little seconds, 4... The wood hit the metal below, 30 or 40 feet. Without cushioning, a bone-breaking certainty. He kicked the gap wider. His boot came away steaming and smouldering. The hole was 3 feet in diameter and growing. He made his move. He wrapped the mattress he dragged from the upper bunk tightly around him, held the mattress from the lower bunk over his head, and leapt through the hole. The lower mattress plugged the hole, giving him perhaps 5 seconds of protection as he plunged towards the pool of acid that was already working its way through the floor of the maintenance deck. He flung off the mattress that was curled around him and hurled it down to the smoking pool below. He landed on his back, winded, dazed, and immobile. He looked up towards the ceiling and saw 3 globules of acid dropping towards him. He tried to twist right, but his body refused to move. That was a hell of a fall, it was saying. Let's rest here for a while. 2 of the drops cut penny-cent holes in the mattress, centimetres from his groin. The 3rd removed his left earlobe. Lister and his body had another meeting. Top of the agenda was a proposal to move ASAP. It was proposed by Lister, seconded by his body, and the motion was carried by 2 votes to 0. He rolled onto his side as the temporary plug above finally gave, and torrents of acid cascaded through the hole, crashing onto the mattress, barely a yard from his gasping, mono-lobed body. He picked himself up and started to stagger down the length of the maintenance deck, looking for something, anything that might offer some form of protection. He ripped the first aid kit from the wall and pulled out the bottle of medicinal alcohol. He poured a generous measure over the hole in his hand, dabbed his left ear, and drank the rest. Then he lumbered into the engineering supply area. He slammed a pallet onto the forks of one of the 3 orange stacker trucks and piled it high with oxyacetylene canisters, blowtorches, and welding gear. He glanced up at the ceiling. It would hold for 15 minutes, 20 at best. After that, there was nowhere else on board to shelter. There was no more down. The only way was out. Out in the acid storm. For the next quarter of an hour, he blowtorched steel doors from their hinges, ripped steel piping from the walls, and welded together a jerry-built acid raincoat. He raced back into the engineering store and tried on the various welding helmets. He discovered that if he crammed his head into the smallest, he was then able to wear a medium size on top of it and a large one on top of that. In the howling metallic silence imposed by 3 steel helmets, he climbed into the suit. 6 feet of solid steel on top of him, plus his helmets, plus the metal piping sleeves and trousers. This would give him at least 15 minutes of protection while he scampered out of the craft and sought out some kind of refuge. Only one problem. He couldn't move. He couldn't even nearly move. Stupid. Stupid, stupid, stupid. How could he have wasted 15 precious minutes constructing this immobile monstrosity without realizing the damn thing was going to be too heavy to move? He climbed out of the suit and kicked it. Now he had a broken toe to add to his troubles. He looked up at the ceiling. The stalactites were already forming. He tottered over to the viewport window and stared out into the storm. He registered with a shock that the rain was local. Totally local. It just swirled around the small basin in which Starbug had come to rest. Over the crest of the hill, the sky was clear. The crest of the hill was hardly 500 yards away. Surely he could get the damn thing to move 500 yards, 1/3 of a mile. Come on, think! His eyes swept the room. On the second pass, they stopped on the stacker truck. Lister jumped into the driver's seat and started up the motor. He jabbed the truck's forks under the 2 arms of the suit and pulled back the lift lever. Slowly the truck hauled the suit off the ground. He leapt down from the vehicle, raced back to the supply store, and returned with a reel of steel cable. As the floor around him hissed and spluttered, he welded the cable to the stacker truck's twin joystick controls and fed it through the sleeves of the armor-plated raincoat. He flipped the bay doors over to manual and typed in the opening code. They remained closed. He tried again. Nothing. Acid fizzled down the doorway. The electrics were shot to hell. There was a rumble from the far end of the maintenance deck, and a whole 20-yard section of ceiling smashed to the floor. Lister was completely unaware of the tears that coursed down his grease-streaked cheeks, and of the insane babble that chundered from his lips as he raced back and climbed into the suit. He yanked the left-hand cable, and his neck snapped forward as the stacker truck lurched back and reversed 50 yards, slamming into the rear bulkhead. The suit tottered on the forks. If he fell now, if he fell and lay motionless on the floor as the acid swirled in from the deck above. Gently he tugged the right-hand cable, and the truck moved forward. He tugged again. The electric motor whined to maximum pitch. The truck gathered speed. It screamed towards the bay doors, supporting Lister in his reinforced steel suit at the front. Acid drizzled delta patterns down the bay doors as Lister and the stacker truck smashed through the weakened structure and out into the eye of the acid storm. The truck's caterpillar tracks jutted over the basin's jagged terrain, gradually picking up the speed it had lost on impact with the doors. When Lister came to, he was halfway up the basin's incline. Over the peak of the hill before him, he could see the clear sky hanging a lazy blue over the next valley. 200 yards to go. He scanned the ground. Bizarrely, insanely, it seemed to be composed of broken bottles. He looked around. The whole of the mountain appeared to be glass. Millions upon millions of glass bottles, all shapes, all sizes, but only one color, green. In fact, as he looked through the acid mist, he realized that all the mountains looming around him were likewise constructed of green bottles. What was this place? Overnight ice ages, acid rain that cut through steel, and a landscape made entirely of glass. Nice place for a holiday. There was a muffled bang from behind him, and the stacker truck jerked and stopped. Lister craned round to see why. The truck was scarcely recognizable, a melting mess of metal and plastic. He tugged on the right-hand cable with idiot optimism. The cable snapped and slithered through the sleeve of his suit, gouging a thin red line of pain along the length of his arm. He hung from the forks of the truck as the rain rodded down and bounced, sizzling, from his suit. Helpless and immobile, he swung like a giant metal pub sign. He tried to lift his arms. Impossible. The suit was too heavy. So, he just swung there, wondering how long it would take him to die, when the rain eventually got through, and how much of him would be left for the others to find. Rimmer, Crichton and the cat disembarked from the shuttle bus mid-afternoon the previous Tuesday and staggered surreally up the metal ramp to the drive room.
"Look, stay calm,"
said Rimmer, manically pacing up and down in front of the vast screen.
"It'll take Holly 10 seconds to work out what to do, and then we'll be out of here."
"Does anybody want toast?"
came a small, tinny voice. They turned and saw the toaster perched on top of a stack of terminals.
"No!"
they screamed in unison.
"How about a crumpet?"
Crichton tapped in Holly's activation sequence and handed voice command over to Rimmer.
"On,"
said Rimmer.
"Holly, we're being sucked into a black hole. How do we get out?"
The giant screen flitted and flickered before Holly's image assembled in a mad cubist parody of itself. His chin was where his forehead should be, his mouth was replaced by an ear, and his nose pointed skywards on top of his balding pate. He said.
"What?" "There's something wrong,"
Rimmer yelled.
"Turn him off! We're wasting his run time!"
Crichton slammed the flat of his palm on the keypad, and Holly fizzled away.
What's wrong with him?
Rimmer and the cat shared shrugs.
"It's the dilation effect. His terminals are spread all over the ship. They're all operating in different time zones. While it's midnight Monday for his central processing unit, it's a week on Thursday for his random access memory. Anybody fancy a muffin?"
"Will you shut up?"
said Rimmer.
"What the smeg are we going to do?"
"What happens?"
The cat tilted his head to one side.
"If we get sucked into this black hole, is that a bad thing?" A black hole is an unstable star that's collapsed into itself. Its gravitational pull is so enormous that nothing can escape. Light, time, nothing. How about a potato cake?"
"Look, will you kindly shut your grill?"
Rimmer spat.
"I'm trying to think."
"Can't we just fly through it?"
the cat ventured.
"And out the other side?"
"Nice idea," the toaster scoffed.
"And perhaps we can stop off at the souvenir shop in the middle and buy various black hole memorabilia."
"Black holes have souvenir shops in the middle?"
The cat grinned hopefully.
"He's taking the smeg,"
snapped Rimmer.
"Will you stop talking to that cheap piece of junk? We've got to work out how to get out of here."
"Cheap?"
the toaster snorted.
"I'm $19.99 plus tax."
"There's no way out, is there?"
said Crichton.
"We're going to
He smacked his head into a monitor housing and cleared the seizure loop.
Die."
"Not necessarily,"
said the toaster with all the smugness he could muster. "If you don't shut up," Rimmer threatened, "I'm going to unplug you." You don't want to know how to get out of this mess, then?" Rimmer spun on his heels. "Oh, and you know, do you?" The toaster's browning knob spun from side to side. "Maybe," he said enigmatically. "Who's for a toasted muffin?"